Well, good morning, everybody. I was going to tell you happy springtime, but I had to put my overcoat on. It's pretty cold out there.
Still a little chilly.
It's really warm in the room, though. Pam Saucy's back with me again today. Pam, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me, Barry.
And, you know, she's really a great guest, but today we're going to talk about a subject that's dear to our hearts and something that offends both of us. It's racism, and it's a very serious issue that, unfortunately, you would think in 2018 that there'd be more civility in this country, but there's less civility and more racism than we ever believed. Isn't that true?
Yes, sadly it is, even though, we live in a country where we literally are a melting pot of all sorts of cultures. Today it seems like we're more afraid and more biased about everyone that is different, and it's really causing a problem with our criminal justice system and with our culture in general.
Well, in terms of the criminal justice system, that's where we're going to begin our discussion, but I want to point out that because of the influx of immigrants from all over the world, especially into the area of southeastern Michigan, we have a problem with racism because many people who come from the Middle East or come from Europe, Eastern Europe, have certain bias and prejudice against African Americans, and they should be unfounded because they've never lived or dealt with African Americans. Isn't that true?
Yes. And for example, you bring up the fact that in this part of town we have a very diverse population. For example, in Dearborn we have Middle Eastern people, we have Hispanic people in the southwest part of Detroit, and we have a very booming African American culture down here, and it seems like we're more afraid of each other than we are trying to get to know one another, and the fear is what is causing the problem, I believe.
Well, that's just one of the issues, but it's another issue when there are cultural disparities that exist, and we get people involved in law enforcement with cultural disparities.
Yes, and if we are not adequately training our police force, especially when we have cities where there are different cultures, if we're not making sure that the police are treating everyone equally, then there is a big issue going on. And we've seen that. We've seen that in different cities throughout the state of Michigan and throughout the country recently.
And one of the major problems that I'm embarrassed, but it truly exists, is that African Americans are not treated the same in the judicial system.
That's exactly right. And I do civil rights work, I do police brutality work, and I do public defender, criminal defense work. And unfortunately, a lot of my clients in regards to the police brutality work happen to be African American. And usually my lawsuits will have some type of racial discrimination as a part of them, that my clients are targeted because of who they are and treated a certain way just because of the way they look, which is against the law.
Now, your office is in Detroit, correct?
Yes, my office is in Greektown at 400 Monroe Street, Suite 280, and that's in Detroit, Michigan, 48226. I'm right above Fishbones and across the street from Greektown Casino, which is nice.
And she's no stranger to the city of Detroit. She went to U of D Law School. You went to high school in Harper Woods.
Yes, I am a native of the east side of Detroit. My family all went to Finney High, and then I went to Harper Woods. I'm a University of Michigan graduate. I went to law school at Detroit Mercy, and I practiced in downtown Detroit for 6 years, and then before actually being a lawyer, I've been there since 2005. So I love the city, and that's one of the reasons I keep my office downtown, is because Wayne County, specifically, the court system can be seen as hard to navigate, but if you know how to work Wayne County, you can be a really good lawyer in other courts. So I want to make sure that my home base is in Wayne County.
Now, your practice is civil and criminal.
Correct.
So you see both sides of the paintbrush there when I'm talking about the racial imbalances that exist.
Yes, sometimes I'll have a client that comes in for a criminal matter, and we deal with the criminal matter, get it addressed, get him or her acquitted, and then at that stage they potentially have a civil rights action for being maliciously prosecuted, for being unlawfully arrested, for excessive force, and then at that point you can file a claim for a civil rights violation, either in state court or federal court.
Now, in terms of racial profiling, would you agree with me that DWB is still a big issue?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay, and DWB is driving while black. I always mention when I drive home on the weekend, if I come to the city, which I often do. I was here last night and probably be here tonight watching the robotics at
Yes, there's a
Ford
huge
Field.
convention going on.
My guest last week was involved in robotics. She practices law, and this is her passion.
Very
She's
nice.
head of the state program. But coming home tonight, I know when I get towards Bloomfield Township or just north of the expressway in Southfield, I'm going to see a lot of vehicles that are going to be stopped around midnight.
Oh, of course. I live in Grosse Pointe, and we have the same type of situation as once you cross, they say, the border, the 7-8 mile border. If you're driving and you're not a white person in a fancy car, you are going to be profiled in some way or another. And I've even been driven or followed home because, 10 years ago I was driving a Neon. I couldn't afford to have a nice car. And the fact that I didn't have an expensive car was a reason for a cop to follow me home. So cops follow people home and profile all the time just based on, for example, race or not having a nice car in a nice neighborhood.
Yeah, just think of it in the real world. Somebody's driving a BMW and they're Caucasian, and you're driving a Honda. And the guy in the BMW's had 3 drinks. He's been downtown, had dinner. He's driving home, and he's staying in the line, but his car's wavering a little bit, as he goes. Nobody's going to stop him. But if the person is African American in the Honda, and they just go out of that line once and they've had a drink or two, they're going to get pulled over.
Oh, of course.
They're going to be in jail for the weekend. Their car's going to get searched. God forbid if they have a prior record and they find a knife in the car, they're going to be charged with possession of an illegal weapon in addition to driving under the influence of alcohol. It defies logic. It
Yes.
doesn't make sense.
And police officers will use, for example, a civil infraction or something as pretext to stop someone when really they're trying to profile someone. And so they'll say, for example, in the police report, that they rolled and stopped at a stop sign, or that they had some type of device in their car hanging from their window that was not allowed. And so they stopped them for that reason, when really they're stopping them because they're black, or they're driving in a city where their race is not welcomed.
On Thursday, a woman called me. She was in one of the large emergency rooms at a hospital, and she left with her son. So the security guard said, "You took somebody's telephone, cell phone." She said, "I didn't." She started to get in the cab. They pulled her and her son out of a cab. They called the Detroit police. They were searched. It was humiliating. In front of all these people who were waiting, they looked at the cameras. The police apologized to them. Security guard said nothing.
Interesting. That's what, when you mention that, if someone came to me with that happening, the first thing I would do is get subpoenas out to check those videos. Because again, if you don't have proof and you have an officer, a lot of times people will just believe what the officer says because of the position that they have. That police officers are people you're supposed to trust.
But this is a problem that's rampant. It's not going away. And now, with the change in the dynamics of the social economic configuration of Detroit, we have a greater problem. We have people from outside of Detroit, outside the state of Detroit, are getting hired. They're coming here. There's sticker shock. If you look at the price of condominiums and homes in the city, we're talking about $250,000 for a one-bedroom apartment if you're buying a small condominium, up to $500,000 for a home in the city of Detroit. And all the neighborhoods in the city of Detroit that surround this area, nothing's changed. Nothing's improved. And Detroit, as I told you this morning, is number 5 in the poverty list in the United States, which is unbelievable. They're bringing people in who are pumping money into one segment of the city, and everyone else is suffering.
And one of the reasons that that's happening is based on the way that the tax structure in the city was developed. And we have this Detroit Developmental Authority where the the revenue that's generated from the booming businesses that are happening downtown, which is good. We need to have that advancement, but it's not getting spread throughout those neighborhoods. And that's one of the reasons why people, they want to see the movement and the activity in the neighborhoods, because that's where people live. That's where us real people live. We're not living downtown paying $2,000 to $3,000 a month for rent in an apartment and paying $150 a month for parking. Real people can't afford that kind of stuff. So, and again, I'm going on a tangent, but yes, Detroit needs to, as a city, the revenue that's being generated needs to be spread to all of the people that are living there, because again, we all pay taxes. Detroit residents pay taxes.
We're going to take a break for a minute, and we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up, because there's a social issue that we have to face in order to resolve our problems to avoid criminality exposure. We'll be right back. At least I thought we'd be right back, but we'll continue on
Okay.
then, because our technician stepped out, so we're not going to take a break. No, that's okay. We'll stay on. We had a conversation with our technician. But here's the problem. We're number one in illiteracy in the United States as far as our kids are concerned. Isn't that true?
Yes, Detroit is ranked number one for illiteracy, which is a travesty.
So as you know, at the end of the third grade, there's an MEP examination that's given and another one at the eighth grade.
Yes.
Would you agree with me in talking with your clients and meeting with your clients that many of your clients can't read?
It's quite alarming. I do a lot of public defender work, and I will have clients that are in their 40s and their 50s, and they cannot read or write, and they're embarrassed. And there's an element of shame that comes with that. And if we are not teaching our children from the very get-go how to read, we are not allowing them, we're not giving them any opportunity to succeed as a child, as an adult, and we're letting people go down a hole where they can't do anything but accept criminal activity. If you can't read and write, what are you going to do?
Here's how it breaks down. They take the MEP, they fail the MEP, go to the fourth grade, they're put in special ed.
Yes.
You see it every day. I see it every day, don't you?
And our funding is determined based on those scores that our children take at that third grade level. So making sure that the illiteracy is addressed is a huge issue.
So the funding's addressed, kids are put in special ed, parents are told that their children have ADD or developmentally they're disabled in some way, which is not true.
Yeah, it's another way for an excuse to, for example, for not actually getting to the substance of the problem. Let's try and medicate someone, as opposed to dealing with the fact that this child, maybe they have issues that need to specifically be addressed, that they don't have ADD, but they need someone to work with them on an individual basis. And we have children in schools right now where you're having 40 kids in a classroom, and a teacher can't give the time to the child in a way that is beneficial to them when they're dealing with 40-plus children.
So they start putting labels on people. And once you start putting labels on people and stigmatizing people, what happens?
That's who you become. When people start saying, you are this, you are A, B, C, you start to believe that, and then you live that.
And then by the time you reach the eighth grade and you take another MEP study and you go to the ninth grade, you're ready to drop out of school.
Exactly.
And that's when the juvenile justice system takes over and you start seeing clients. Isn't that true?
Yes, and the rate of juveniles being prosecuted in Michigan and in the country is alarming. The United States has, statistically based on a national level, we have more juveniles prosecuted and incarcerated than any other industrial nation, which is very alarming. What we're doing is we're not giving our kids a chance to succeed at the very beginning, and then they get out of the education system and they have nowhere to go. If you're not literate, you can't read and write, you can't go to college, you can't get a job. And so you're looking for other ways to make money. And sometimes that becomes illegal activity.
That's the accelerator. It starts the process going. We've got 9,000 high school dropouts in the city of Detroit alone.
And another thing is, I know last time I was on the show, you had skilled trades, you had a discussion about skilled trades. That is something that needs to be emphasized in the curriculum in Michigan and throughout the United States because, again, everyone is not going to be on this one-track race. And not everyone is going to go to college. We have to have opportunities for children to be able to do other things, to be electricians, to work in car plants, to be part of unions, to be able to do skilled labor that they could make a livable wage, good money, as opposed to doing an accounting job or going to college to be a lawyer.
Believe it or not, there's a direct relationship between employment and criminality.
Yes, there is.
Now, you just represented a young man, and we won't talk about what court, but the young man committed a crime, correct?
Yes, I had a client who was caught with a gun in his car in Oakland County, and he had the gun in his car because he lived in Detroit, and he had a fiance and a baby, and he was scared. He had the paperwork to go down and get his CPL, but he got pulled over by the police beforehand, and he was up to a CCW. Being caught with a gun is a 5-year felony, and his guidelines were up to 2 years in prison. So he was potentially facing some real time, and he was very scared about it because he had a family and he had a job.
He did no time, though.
He did no time. Thank the Lord, after submitting a very in detailed sentencing memorandum, I got my client 1 day with time served, 1 year probation, non-reporting, ability to travel because he's part of the IBW, HIDA, which means it comes off your record after the 1 year probation. And so after all of this, he will have a clean record and he can continue on. He made a mistake. And a lot of times, depending on where you live, people are trying to self-govern themselves because you look at the response rate when you call 911 with the police, and it's, 9 minutes, sometimes it's 15 minutes. So you're starting to regulate yourself. And when you live in a city where there's so much crime, specifically my backyard is 48205, and we talk about the gangs that are rising there, you try and take care of yourself. But the bottom line is, if you don't have a valid permit, you can't have a gun.
We have too much vigilance going on anyways,
Yes.
and that's another issue. However, getting back to your client, just by way of example, your client's employed.
Yes, and that was one of the reasons why the judge gave him probation.
Your client has a real job,
Yes.
and that's my point. If you complete school and you get a real job, you're going to stay out of the system.
Yes.
But if you don't go to school or you drop out and you don't go back to school or get into one of these retraining programs and get a real job, you're going to be in the system, aren't you?
Most likely, because how else are you going to make ends meet?
Yeah, I mean, either you're going to make it one way or the other, but you've got to pay your bills. And we
Yes.
understand that, so you're going to go to the street. And when you go down to Frank Murphy Hall of Justice, it's full of young people. Every Monday morning, it's full of young people.
Most people that I represent as a public defender are 17 to 25. It's a young class of individuals, and it goes back to having idle hands lead to bad activity. When you have too much time on your hands, you're going to do something bad. So again, having a good job and having a good education and having a good background that puts you in the position to be able to stay out of the criminal justice system.
You know, they used to talk about the child left behind, but Detroit is the child left behind. Detroit, the city of Detroit, is being left behind at the expense of suburbanites and millenniums coming into the city, making big bucks and leaving the city.
Yes.
And leaving Detroit in the same condition as it was after the Detroit riots.
That's very true. There's so many schools that have closed in the city of Detroit, and because people are leaving the city, we're losing the tax revenue, and our schools are suffering as a result. And people that live in Detroit, they want their kids to go to good schools. And so a lot of times they go to private schools or they go to charter schools, but we don't have regulations on these schools at the state level. And charter schools sometimes open 1 week and close the next week.
Why should a city that's responsible for the development of automobiles and at the height of manufacturing post-World War II had 1.25 million people exist with 600,000 people today, when a city like Las Vegas has 2.25 million people who are permanent residents living there.
We don't have jobs, and we don't have the people to fill the jobs. So there's big infrastructure issues. Amazon didn't come here because we didn't have the working force, we didn't have the infrastructure, we didn't have the mass transportation. These are things that can put people to work, and we can have contracts to make sure that Detroit residents are filling those positions.
So it's up to us to turn the tide.
Yes, it is. We have to make the change.
Right, it's up to us to get after the school board to set up a proper program to educate children and to make sure that students who've been identified with learning disabilities be reevaluated to determine whether their learning disabilities are actually, they're limited because they were never taught to read.
That is very true. And, I don't mean to interrupt, but a lot of students, or a lot of teachers are being, for example, they'll have a class of 30 and they'll have maybe 5 or 10 people on on specific developmental plans, as opposed to having a special education program for students that really need it. And so we're giving more work to teachers that aren't adequately prepared to handle that situation. And we're defunding our special education programs, which are what are needed to make sure that we address the issues with students that really have them.
It seems to me that the state of Michigan and the federal government has been very deliberate when it comes to the Detroit school system and not helping develop the education of young individuals.
I think this goes to the fact that we have to look at what our state house and our state senate are doing, and look at the laws that we have in place regarding our curriculum and regarding private and charter schools and regarding the funding of our schools. That goes back to, we got to know who we're voting into office and who we're giving our tax money to make our laws in this state, because education needs to be addressed. And we have a big issue in Michigan in regards to, it's not only Detroit schools. It's happening in other jurisdictions where we have this school of choice. For example, in Plymouth and Canton, it's causing a deterioration of the school districts themselves, because people are leaving the schools and going to other districts because they want to go to a good school.
Well, the other issue has to do with the charter schools, though, when the federal government said that the tax dollars, and the state of Michigan said that the tax dollars that are generated through income tax and other forms of tax could be used for charter schools. And that's a choice. You want to go to a charter school? Go to a charter school. Pay for it out of your pocket, just like a private school. Don't take money away from public education, because public education desperately needs
Exactly.
more than a Band-Aid.
And that seems like a mechanism to defund public education.
Absolutely, and that's what's happened. Public education needs a complete overhaul. A complete overhaul. And our listeners out there, I know it's only 10:30, so you're getting up. Usually I get you in the second half an hour to call in. You want to call in today because we need your help. You know, if I say on the TV today that we ought to have a march on the Board of Education, how many people are going to come out to that march if I call for the march to get something done? Call me and let me know if you'll come, because I want to have a march on the Board of Education when school's out. I want to make a difference here. We've got to do something constructive, because nothing's happening. It's making me sick to see all these kids running away when they're teenagers because they can't go to school. We've got wonderful vocational programs set up here. Nobody's taking advantage of them because they can make more money in the street until they get shot. They can make more money in the street until they get arrested. They can make more money in the street until they're pregnant. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Burt, and good morning to you again. I would definitely come because I have an artistic grandson. They just stuck him in classes with regular children.
Okay, so your grandson is autistic, correct?
Yes,
Does your grandson go to public school?
yes.
And does he get special treatment at public school because he's autistic?
Not, no.
What school does he go to, ma'am?
I don't know the name of it. It's on the east side. My name is Sullivan. But he's 11 now, but they have always mixed him in with regular children.
That's one of the issues that's going on in public schools, is that we don't have the funding to support the special education program. So, again, regular teachers that don't have the experience with teaching in special education are handling children that need to have a specific curriculum. And I botched the word. It's an IDP plan, correct? Am I saying
Yes.
that right? Where students will be on these plans when really they should be in a focused setting with a special education teacher so that they can address those issues that they're dealing with. Because obviously your grandson is probably suffering, and other people in the room are probably suffering as a result as well. And it's because they're not addressing the children's needs the way they need to be done. Your grandchild needs to be taught in a certain way, and he's not being benefited, and I'm sure you're paying tax dollars for the school that you're going to.
And those listeners out there who wonder why we're talking about this, it's because there's a direct relationship between not receiving an education and criminality.
Yes.
And there's no two ways about it. I can assure you, only the lack of education.
It's a lack of opportunity. If you're not taught, or if you don't know that you can have these certain opportunities, then you go to what you see and what is easy. And a lot of times what's easy is what's illegal or something you shouldn't be doing.
It's only surpassed, by the way, by racial profiling. And we'll be right back.
Are you in legal trouble? Are you in need of legal advice? Or just have general legal questions? Call 1-800-529-8721. That's 1-800-LAW-USA1. And watch Law Power Hour and get your questions answered by experienced attorneys who are experts in their field. That's Law Power Hour, hosted by Barry Keller, attorney at law. Saturdays at 10 a.m. here on WHPR Detroit Live.
Well, I think it's important for us to talk about racial profiling because one of the large coffee chains in this country is addressing the issue on the 29th of May by shutting down for a half a day to deal with the racial profiling issue, but it's something that unfortunately exists every day. Isn't that true?
Yes, unfortunately, wherever we go, it seems that some type of profiling, especially racial profiling, is being done.
And in the context of racial profiling, not only in terms of people frequenting and using public facilities, but also in terms of jobs.
Yes, and one thing that you learn as a lawyer and that we know as a lawyer is that you can't use race as a reason to, for example, fire someone. We're an at-will state, but you can't use race as a justification to fire someone. Race is a protected class, like religion. And so when someone tries to infringe on your rights based on your race or your religion, those laws are most likely going to be struck down because they have to be so compelling to be able to be legal in the first place. So for example, someone's in a coffee shop and they walk in and they sit down for a few minutes. Excuse me, got a frog in my throat this morning. That's a matter of whether or not you're on public versus private property, and it's a matter of trespassing. Now, a lot of times, for example, say you're in West Bloomfield or whatnot, and you get an African American person that walks in, and they sit down for a few minutes before they order a coffee. Maybe they're waiting for someone. Technically, that's private property, and if they're not buying something or don't have an intention to buy something, they could be made to leave. But if they're going to buy something and they're just waiting for a few minutes, the fact of what their race is should not be a determining factor to say stay or leave. But that's what happens.
It happens all over town.
Yes,
though.
and that's what happened with that coffee shop. Someone happened to come in, wait a few minutes. Oh, because of the color of their skin, we're going to say they're trespassing.
And that's the reason why the coffee shop is going to go through some training.
Correct.
They call it sensitivity training, but there's no need for sensitivity training. It should have existed throughout, but what happens is that there's some preconceived notions, and these notions and prejudices start in the home when they're of tender age.
Yes.
And they carry on throughout life, and they become associated with stigmatizing individuals.
Yeah, children are colorblind. We learn our biases and our prejudices. We learn the way that we act as an adult. I'm digressing a lot right here because, again, this isn't really about the law. It's more about how we're raised. And fear and ignorance is what leads to, I think, biases and having prejudice against someone. Because if you don't know and you're unfamiliar, or you're taught that they're unfamiliar, then you become afraid.
But it carries over, though. I mean, let's be realistic. Prosecutors have it. Judges have it. Jurors have it. Lawyers have it. Doctors have it.
It starts in the home.
And that's my point. So it does carry over, and it affects us professionally because we've got to deal with the fallout of it every day.
Oh, yes. That's why, for example, you have certain, like, if you're a racist cop, you're going to act as a racist cop. You're going to go out there and you're going to profile people that you don't like. If you're a prosecutor and you don't happen to like a certain race, you're probably going to go heavier on prosecuting those types of people.
You've seen it in your
Yes.
practice. You've seen it with judges.
And it depends on what county you're in as well.
And you go to pick a jury, you see it, don't you?
Yes, yes, and that's, for example, in my civil rights cases, I was talking to Barry about this. When I file a civil rights case, depending on where it happened, I have to think, am I going to file it in state court or am I going to file it in federal court? And that's based on who the possible jury could be. So, for example, if I had a client that was beaten up by the police in Oakland County and he's a black man, I would not file that in Oakland County Circuit Court because I won't get a good jury. I will get mostly probably affluent white people. So I would file that in federal court. But for example, if something like that happened in Detroit where I had a client, or Dearborn, or Inkster, I would file the case in Wayne County because I would have a diverse jury pool in Wayne County.
And
That
you
makes
don't-
sense.
I understand that. You're not going to have that diverse pool there. You're going to get Waterford and Clarkston
Correct.
and Rochester, and they're all going to be out there. And God knows what happens in Rochester. I mean, a poor kid goes up and knocks
On
on
the-
the door, and they almost blow his head off.
Right?
But-
And so even those jurors will have a preconceived bias.
And I don't know why you folks want to move out to Rochester and Clarkston. They keep on raising the price of the homes to keep you out anyways. It doesn't make any sense. The only thing it does is it lowers your insurance rate in your car.
Well, one of the things that, when you live in an affluent community, you have those tax dollars so that you feel safe. You have a high response time with EMS and with police officers. And again, that goes back to, if you've got the money, then you can afford to be safe. But again, we got to think, Detroit residents and people living in Wayne County are paying tax dollars. So we should have services. We should feel safe. We should have response time with EMS and with police officers.
This racism issue is something that carries over in the treatment of individuals, whether they're in the judicial system, whether they're receiving medical treatment, whether they're in a convalescent home, or whether they're in rehabilitation. It just carries over, and we've got to combat racism.
I think we all need to be a little colorblind.
Well, it's
Then-
a little more than being colorblind. We've got to stand up and do something about it because it's not being done.
Exactly. And we need to make sure that we're raising our children to speak up about it, to speak up that this is wrong. I mean, I was raised that we're all the same. If you happen to be a jerk, you're a jerk. But if you're purple and you're a jerk, that just means you're purple. I don't care. So I was raised to treat everyone how I would want to treat myself. And that's how I function as a lawyer. That's how I function as a person.
Well, it makes a lot of sense, but the first issue is how do we address it to make sure that our kids get the right education?
It starts with education. It starts with funding public education. It starts with making sure we're not trying to defund public education and make education about profit, which is what seems to be happening at the national and the state level right now with education for profit, charter schools for profit.
I don't see anybody bringing free programs in to educate kids. I see a lot of not-for-profit organizations coming in with a bill of goods for different types of programs, and they're top-heavy. By being top-heavy, it means that the people who are at the top of the not-for-profits are making a lot of money.
And the problem is the people that are making a lot of money, it's an issue because these schools don't have standards. So at the state level, there's no one saying these charter schools have to have this certain curriculum or these certain classes. They can do whatever they want. They can basket weave.
It's a little confusing for me. I will candidly admit I live in a very nice neighborhood in Bloomfield Hills, and a couple of people who are my neighbors, they run charter schools in the city of Detroit. It doesn't make sense to me that you can run a charter school in the city of Detroit and live in Bloomfield Hills and understand the problems of the city of Detroit.
No, you're living in two different worlds. If you live in Oakland County, I'm born and raised on the east side of Detroit. My significant other, my boyfriend, he's from Oakland County. We could seriously live in separate countries by the fact that we're just in different counties. So yes, where you live, where you have grown up, that really has an impact on how you perceive things and people and the criminal justice system and education.
Yeah, and we don't have to be in somebody else's skin to understand their problems. We're professionals. We deal with it every day.
Yes.
And we see it every day, and it's distasteful, and something has to be done about it. Now, it's up to our listeners, and I'm going to say this again, it's up to our listeners out there to champion the cause and to do something about it with us instead of not addressing the issue and saying it doesn't apply to me, so I'm not going to deal with it. It's the next guy's problem.
That's very true.
Yeah, and that carries over in the context of who's committing crimes. You know, you can't go out and get your newspaper, you can't take your trash out, and you can't see people going down the street carrying guns when you know it's illegal to carry guns. There's some accountability, on the other hand, to make sure that we have a safe neighborhood.
Yes, and I think that goes, again, back to making sure that we have services that are provided to us when we're paying tax dollars, making sure we have a police department that are driving through the streets, that are monitoring what's happening in our neighborhoods so that people aren't driving 60 miles an hour down the street, so that there aren't young children, 14, 15-year-olds, becoming involved in gangs and having firearms. There's a big issue going on, especially on the east side, with young people becoming involved with gang violence. And it's literally my backyard. Where I used to play growing up is now one of the most dangerous parts in the city. And there's been huge news stories about it. It's called, I'm not going to say it correctly, but there are a bunch of federal indictments for specific members of the 7 Mile Blood Gang, if I'm saying that correctly.
You got it down pat. It is a blood gang.
And that's literally in my backyard. And a lot of these people that are involved in these gangs are young people. And I am a sound believer that if we get people involved in other activities that they take ownership in and that they're prideful in, that they won't be on the street. They won't be messing with drugs, and they won't be dealing with firearms, because they're going to have something that they're passionate about. And that goes back to education. It goes back to the home. It goes back to putting an emphasis on making sure that our schools are doing what they're supposed to do. And right now in this country, public education seems to be on a very shaky level. Because
Now, that's because we have a Secretary of Education who supports charter schools.
and that's a big problem.
And she's an elitist. You know, when you have money, well, you can look at things differently. You can send your kids to private schools or to charter schools. You can do as you see fit. But you can't deal with the real problems. But if you had somebody who was in a public school, who understood public schools, understood community problems, if the Secretary of Education came from the inner city of Detroit and grew up and was educated in Detroit, he or she would be in a better position to address the issues nationally than some woman who's a billionaire.
Yes, yes. There's a big disconnect with who is running our education system in the country and the people that are actually living the education system. I think DeVos should probably come down to Detroit and spend a couple weeks in our schools and see what our children and our teachers have to deal with.
Well, she was here yesterday for the robotics program.
Where? Oh, okay. And what school was she at, though?
No, she wasn't at any school.
Okay.
She was at the robotics, and she was driving around with the robotics, and someone from Brother Rice, which is a wonderful suburban Catholic school,
But for example,
tooled her around, you know, and they're disengaged from the community out there anyways in Birmingham. They don't know what's going on in Detroit.
but Barry, you brought up a great an example of the robotics competition. We could be having programs in our public schools for robotics.
We do, but they're limited because we don't have enough volunteers. We don't have enough participants for the programs.
Well, that's a
Gail
shame.
Alpert was here last week, and she's worked very hard. She said there's money available. All you have to do is set up the program. Can start in kindergarten and go all the way up through high school. They have money available for the schools and for the programs. We just don't have people that can be vetted who are out of trouble, who've never been in trouble, to become active in the programs to help the kids. If you have two things going on that coexist, robotics and reading, starting in kindergarten, what's the result? Amazon comes to Detroit instead of turns their back on Detroit. What's the result? We don't have to bring in 500,000 engineers from outside the United States, from India and from China, and that's where they're going to come from. They're going to come from the United States. They're going to come from the Detroit. What's the result in Detroit? We're going to have more people educated in Detroit, and we're going to have more people having a better life in Detroit. Instead of tearing down neighborhoods and building apple orchards, listen to me very carefully, because this really offends me. They're building a big apple orchard over on Charlevoix,
Really?
right next to Indian Village, 200 acres, and all that property was picked up very quietly by a group outside the city of Detroit to build the apple orchards there, which are going on. They're building right now, and the tree farms and everything else. They took all this wonderful property, and they're developing it for whose purpose? Good morning.
Morning. Attorney Keller, you make a great point about the investment, the lack of volunteers into the school system. What happens is that you have parents that are already undereducated, and when you have their students or their children that are trying to teaching them, they feel ostracized because they don't have the right tools to give back to their students, to their children.
I understand that. I grew up in a family where I had to teach my parents about math and science and whatnot, but I know that there's a bigger issue with that with the current generations because, for example, how you're saying the parents were most likely a product of the DPS school system, and that may have been in the 80s or the 90s when the defunding started to happen. So we're having generations of people that have now come out of the public school system, and we're seeing the results of it. Uneducated adults, uneducated children, and we're creating societies and generations of this. And that's a big issue.
And here's Pam Saucy, who has to eradicate these problems. She has to make them go away. She has to go to court, tell them how to get a hold of you, because it's important.
Well, my office is at 400 Monroe Street. It's Suite 280, 48226. I'm going to give my cell phone out because I'm always available by cell phone. It's 313-318-5992. I'm a defense attorney. I do civil rights work, and I also do just regular litigation.
And I'm going to tell you, having practiced for 50 years doing civil rights work, when you sue an employer, they get 4 to 5 lawyers and they, excuse the expression, wallpaper you to death with legal papers.
Yes.
And just try and bludgeon you with legal papers and bury you. They're paying $1,500 to $2,000 an hour for that crew at a very minimum to beat up on people like Pam, who takes on the challenge on behalf of individuals who've been discriminated against.
Yes.
And she should be applauded for the work that she does, because she's trying to make a difference. And
It is rough because, again, you have the cities or the municipalities, and they have a huge legal team, and they will exhaust every hour, anything that they can do to just delay and to stall. And they will always file big motions to try and kick your case out, even when you have good cases. So civil rights work is super important, especially plaintiffs' attorneys that are representing individuals for civil rights work. Because, again, we're talking about racial profiling today. Under the law, they can't use our race to profile us. They can't use our race as probable cause to stop us. It's a protected class under our law. But even though it's protected, we have humans involved. So it happens. People violate these laws. People profile. And that's why we need good lawyers. We need good defense lawyers that are going to be there to say that's wrong. There's someone that's going to be there to file suit on someone that is being racist. We need good lawyers. We need good people.
we need lawyers who are not afraid to take the challenge. But it's got to be a legitimate challenge.
Yes.
You can't say I got fired just because of my color. I got fired because of my color because I was treated differently than the man or the woman next to me, and they did the same thing that I did. They went to the water fountain to get a drink and went to the bathroom and came back to their workstation, and they got fired.
Yes. I do a lot of police brutality work, so my cases are individuals that have been pretty much beaten up by the police officers, charged for something that they shouldn't have been charged for, prosecuted, and so it's not uncommon for me to handle the criminal side and then to handle the civil rights lawsuit after the fact. But those are the cases that I do predominantly, are police brutality.
Are you dealing with taser issues?
I have had one case with a taser issue. My recent case that I had was actually with a dog leash, and my client being strangled with a dog leash from the canine unit.
Excuse me? A dog leash?
Yes.
From somebody in the canine unit?
A retractable dog leash, and my client happened to be developmentally, he had the IQ of a 13-year-old, and he was from the South. He was up here for a family, for a Labor Day event, and some cops saw him and did not like the color of his skin, and my client said, I'm just going on my way, I'm just going to walk, going on my way, minding my business, and the cops did not like that, and 3 years later, we resolved it after him being criminally prosecuted for many years, and then handling the civil rights, the federal claim. But
Hopefully it turned out well.
it did turn out well. It's very sad, though, when you meet individuals that are, just like your good friends, your family members, and just because of the way they look, they're being treated and disrespected, which is, it's disgusting.
There's no satisfaction in having a good result financially, is there, for you?
No,
Because the
good-
crime's already been committed.
Yes, the result is seeing my clients being vindicated.
Right, but the damage has already been done. The
Yes.
client's going to have to live with that for the rest of their life. That's
Yes.
my point. So we recognize that we have our limitations as lawyers and what we can do to turn things around. But we don't want them to get to the point where we have to turn them around. We want those issues dealt with up front so they don't occur. We want sensitivity across the board, whether you're going into a restaurant or whether you're going to go into a coffee shop, whether you're stopping to shop in a store. We don't want racial profiling to exist at all in any spectrum of society. And we have it. You go out to Somerset Mall, for example, you see 4 African Americans and the security guards are on their phones. You see 4 Caucasian shopping, the security guards, "Hi girls,
Right.
how are you? Nice to see you."
Right.
That's the difference, and that's what's going on. It's not mind-boggling, it's a fact. So what we need you folks to do, since you didn't call me today, if you want to have some march to deal with this racism issue in the school system, I want to hear from you by next week. I want you to get a hold of the station, get a hold of my office, and then we'll take the challenge and put something together to get to the school board so that when September comes, we will have something in place for the kids to get things moving forward instead of having another year of bad report cards. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.